Hello, bonsoir, and welcome to the final Get French Football News show of the 2017-18 season, where we look back at every single Ligue 1 team. I'm Nathan Staples, and joining me for the first half of this evening's proceedings are Rich Allen and Peter Rutzler. Before we dive into things, dear listeners, do remember that for all your latest French football news, head on over to our website at www.getfootballnewsfrance.com and follow us on Twitter at GFFN. We'll start where else but the champions, and Paris Saint-Germain had a tremendous domestic season, finishing top of the league and winning both domestic cup competitions and the Trophée des Champions, if you want to count that as a quadruple. I'm sure Emery would quite like that on his CV. But Rich, it was a great domestic season, but at the same time, they failed in Europe again. Will that always be the measuring stick for this team?
Under the new regime, yes. Unfortunately, for any coach coming into PSG, that's where your measure is at. You are expected, and of course, we saw that Emery failed last season. You're expected to win Ligue. You're expected to win Ligue comfortably as well, and a domestic clean sweep is par for the course now. It's kicking on in Europe. Unfortunately for PSG, and unfortunately for Emery, that's not been the case the last two seasons. If anything, they've actually gone backwards, albeit they have obviously come up against two very, very good teams in those. But, the Qatari owners are going to be wanting, if you're going to be, you're going to be the best, you've got to beat the best. And this season, it has been another disappointing season in Europe. I think they obviously came up against Real Madrid, who obviously went on to win the trophy. But you're looking at that first leg, and you go back to just how dominant PSG were, in Madrid as well, and just let it slip in the final 20 minutes to take that defeat at home, where they completely disintegrated at home. It was a pretty poor showing at home, considering it could have been done. It wasn't going to be taking, something too unpredictable for that to happen. But they just failed on that front. And really, ever since then, it's just been on a canter since they wrapped up Ligue 1. And then basically the players just disappeared on their holidays. There was some sloppy performances towards the end of the season. That may or may not be something that can be forgiven, and then obviously finish with Emery and PSG coming to a mutual agreement that he would depart. So it wasn't the sort of progression I think that the PSG hierarchy would have wanted under Emery. So I think it's a new chapter now under Thomas Tuchel, and we'll see where it goes really.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it was a really strong season, especially domestically. Look, they won the first 6 games in a row. It took a draw at Montpellier to really give them any kind of test at all. And then there was that real test against Marseille, the 2-2 draw. They then didn't lose again until that crazy Strasbourg game. There was only then the defeat to Lyon, and then near the very end of the season, the defeat to Rennes at home, breaking that record, which disappoint them a little bit, that they were really strong domestically. And we've already mentioned the cup competitions really were a little bit of a breeze at the same time. But I think the interesting question for this one, Peter, for this season and possibly for the season ahead as well, would they trade that domestic success for a little bit of a taste of Europe? Even I know this is maybe a little bit dramatic, but would they trade all those trophies for even a semi-final of a Champions League?
I think Emery would have. I don't know if PSG would themselves. I think their supporters maybe the same. I think as Rich was outlining, it's all about European success and getting further in the competition, but it's not just about getting further, it's about winning it. And I think part of it is being dominant and being dominant domestically. I don't think there's really a scenario where we'd see that dominance challenged, apart from, of course, with Monaco last year, which seems increasingly like an anomaly. But yeah, no, I think Emery definitely would have grabbed anything to take that. Although that said, he's now got a decent job elsewhere, so maybe not. But I think in general, PSG season, it's such a strange one. It's not something you can really analyze in too much depth, except on Europe. It's like the whole purpose is Europe, and everything else seems a sideshow. And it's that in that sense, it's undermined a lot of the domestic competition. But at the same time, the things they've brought to the division. I mean, Neymar's transfer, I think it was really well written in the GFFN and Guardian piece by Adam and Eric. The impact that's had. We're looking at further investment in other clubs, TV rights deals. So in terms of the domestic spectacle, it's actually been a major boost. If in the short term, hopefully just the short term, we'll have to get used to this dominance from Paris.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing heading into the summer. There's a new manager. There's rumours about Neymar possibly going to Real Madrid, and then looking at other things that are impacted by the FFP regulations as well. The Mbappe signing actually being officially signed off, and then how they still try and improve and shift some of the quote-unquote deadwood, although some of them would definitely say, you think of people like a Julian Draxler, who's still had a good solid season, Pastore as well, even Gonzalo Guedes, who they might offload to Valencia, who's had a terrific season as well. They might get some money back, but whether it be enough, whether they can mix it, it's difficult to tell. But at least they can say that they did the de facto what Paris Saint-Germain have to do in Ligue 1 this season, and it's win that title for sure. And the domestic trouble coming with it is nice enough for them to know that they didn't quite edge it off. On to another team now in Toulouse, who obviously will be joining us in Liga next season again, as they won their playoff against Ajaccio, winning the first leg 3-0 that was played behind closed doors at Montpellier because of the incidents in the previous leg, and then they won 1-0 at home last night to ensure their Liga status next season. But Rich, we've mentioned this a few times in the last couple of weeks. That status is still sort of a little bit under question for next season, at least in terms of where they may finish, not unlike other teams financially, but with players likely to go like Lafont and Diop, while they're at least staying in Liga means they may be able to command a higher fee, replacing them is the other question. And at the same time, the rest of that team really struggled this season to perform anything. There was a couple of flops. Delors didn't really play to the level many expected. Same with Corentin Jean. Gianelli and Boula had a couple of decent games, but wasn't really the show-stopping signing that they thought it'd been. Same with Max Langradel, was very stop-start. That struggle feels like it might continue, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I was one of those that believed actually in the long run it would have done Toulouse good, I think, to have a season out of the top flight, to really allow them and force them to reassess who they are as a club and what their actual ambitions are. Because, I mean, they certainly shouldn't be in the position that they're in. You look at that squad, it's littered with some really, really talented youngsters. And then there's obviously then a sort of smattering then of the more senior players who've seen it, done it kind of thing. So they've really, really underperformed this season. It's going to be interesting, I think. There are, I'm fairly certain Lafont, I'm fairly certain Diop, and probably one or two others won't be there come the start of next season. So they're going to need to, as you said, they're going to need to replace them. They're going to need to be very, very careful on how they replace them. They're probably going to get good money for those two players. So at least they should have something that they can reinvest into who they're going to be bringing in. They're going to need goals ultimately as well next season. Not one of their players hit double figures. Really, if it wasn't for the likes of Max-Alain Gradel and Yaya Sanogo, certainly towards the tail end of the season, I personally think they probably would have slipped into the automatic relegation spots. So it's been a disappointing season for Toulouse. It's been another season where they've not really been able to hold on to a coach who can deliver what is expected. But as I say, this is a team that really shouldn't have finished where they finished. There's talent there. They just need to bring in the right coach, I think, to sort of coax it out of them on a more consistent, regular basis.
Yeah, because we've mentioned earlier this season, Peter, that Pascal Dupraz was maybe the man to coax a performance out of them when they needed it, and gave them a solid base that season where he did sort of consolidate them in Ligue 1. But then as soon as this season started, as soon as it started slipping away, very similar to when he was at Evian, that he couldn't really rally them again with his tactics and his motivational speaking, really, more than anything. And then DeBev has sort of maybe just stayed mute, maybe just got a little bit lucky more than anything. And then the playoff with Ajaccio having several men sent off and playing it away from home as well, both of the legs really silenced them pretty quickly and gave Le Viollet almost a free pass really to resume Ligue 1 status. And that's the important thing now, is the thing that we've seen this season with Toulouse and a couple of seasons ago as well, is that they need the right coach for them, and if they don't, then they're going to be in trouble again.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we're yet to really decide on DeBev. I think what he brought was a sense of stability. I think there was a real unease. I mean, there was the stuff with Julien being stripped of the captaincy and being handed to Diop, and they were just those sort of unsettled. That sense with Depraz that it can almost combust a little bit. And as Rich was saying, there are some really good players in that squad, and I think Adam White's talked about this quite a lot. The loss of Trejo and providing that creative spark to offer them something at the other end of the field is definitely something they've not yet replaced. Jimmy Dermaz was a player who's always looked like he could offer something, but we haven't seen the best of him this season. He was always in and out of the side. So there are certainly elements to the squad, especially the young players that you can really develop with, and maybe it's a lacking on identity, and maybe the sort of the Dupraz sort of firefighter overarching feeling about the club is kind of stagnated with them and won't push them on. And Debev's done a good job, but I think you're right. I think you touched on it. They want to be looking for someone to push them ahead, and there are a number of managers available that could potentially put them on. I think Gorvenek's still available, isn't he? So that's the kind of manager maybe to put an identity on the side going forward if they are looking for a change, certainly.
Maybe someone we might mention a little bit later, because he was spotted heading to a plane to somewhere else in France, Gorvenek, supposedly earlier today. So we might talk about him a little bit later. I'm going to change the order, so sorry to my guests for this a little bit, but there is some breaking news, at least anyway, involving a French side, and it is involving Monaco. There was reports earlier today that Fabinho was close to a move to Liverpool. Well, the club have just confirmed it. Fabinho is a Liverpool player, and they have a nice little video showing him, and it breaks another one of my hearts, having Bernardo Silva having done it last season to Manchester City, but never mind for me.
And only 50 million euros, which it sounds silly, but that to me just seems so cheap for a player like him.
Yeah, and let's talk about that, Rich, first. Obviously, Monaco's season we'll sort of discuss as well, because it was an expected dip with so many players going, and even at the end of the season, the owner admitted that players like Fabinho and Lemar, maybe he'd sort of forced to stay in the end, really. So it's sort of let his hand go and allowed them to sort of leave this summer, starting with the Brazilian, really. And he at least leaves Ligue 1, because the big rumours a long while ago was Paris Saint-Germain, but early this week it looked like Atletico or even Manchester United would be involved. It is Liverpool now. Let's give the Liverpool fans a little bit of something. What can they expect from Fabinho?
They can expect, to keep it simple, they can expect a very, very good midfielder. We saw the brilliant partnership he had season just gone with when Monaco won the title, his partnership with Bakayoko, where they just dominated midfields. He's brilliant at covering that defensive line. He's excellent going forward, very comfortable on the ball, can play the sensible pass, can play the sort of glamour pass, pops up with the odd goal from open play, faultless penalty taker, can play at right back, although hasn't played there now for 2 and a bit seasons. I just think 50 million in this day and age is an absolute snip for a player, and I've just tweeted out, I think it's, as ever, and it's been proved here, get your business done before the major tournaments. I think it's a really, really good bit of business. Seems to happen so quickly. So really good bit of business from Liverpool. Monaco have obviously recouped a great chunk on another player that's gone through. He obviously missed out on a transfer last summer, so I thought there were elements in his play this season where it was clear that I thought he was a bit disappointed that he missed out on that, but it didn't dwell too long. I don't think he was quite at the same level as the previous season, but I think with all the comings and goings at Monaco, I think that can be slightly forgiven and slightly excused. But really, I think looking forward to seeing what he can do in that Liverpool midfield now.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I love Fabinho. Really, I've not stated this before. He was GFFN's Player of the Year for 2017. He was the number one on our list before the list that was released this season. He's a tremendous player. Played, like you say, Rich played right back for a long while. Has transformed into an amazing central defensive midfielder, and it's a real surprise that he's never been involved with the Brazil squad. And some may argue that his powers were really restricted this season without really someone like Bakayoko next to him to give him a forward. But I think that midfield of Naby Keita and Fabinho next season should have Liverpool fans salivating, really. But what else should have? Well, Monaco fans will have to deal without him now, Peter. And their season at the same time, like we've mentioned, was an expected dip. But at the same time, because of where they finished in the end in second, although they sort of crawled to it, and then some of the young players didn't quite come on as they may have expected, except from someone like Ronnie Lopez, who had a terrific season. Does this still count as a good season, especially if they can keep Jardim as well, as it seems like they may?
Yeah, no, I think it does. I think obviously expectations were altered with how well they did last season, and a number of fantastic cogs coming together, and one of them was undoubtedly Fabinho. I think I agree. We haven't seen the best of him really this year. I think Thomas Lamar as well, players who haven't really reached those heights. But I think that's symptomatic of a side that's it's had its legs chopped off in places, and we saw elements of that. And I think when you consider how much stronger Lyon were this season, how much stronger Marseille became, certainly after a slow start, you have to say that, and of course keeping Jardim as well, it's certainly a successful season for Monaco. They came out of the blocks firing, and I think there was this impression that we were going to see it again. Radamel Falcao was almost carrying the side on his own shoulders to an extent, and that sort of unravelled as it went on, and we had this sort of battle of any one of the three of them could take those last two Champions League spots behind Paris Saint-Germain. But Jardim's done a terrific job in moulding what are new elements, disgruntled older elements, and other younger players coming through to form an outlet that's finished second, and still got a very respectable points total. You can't sniff at that. 80 points again. A few years ago, that'd be enough to win the title on its own. So, I mean, of course, there'll be the disappointment of not being able to retain the title. Of course, there'll be the Champions League disappointment as well, where they bombed out very quickly and quite disappointingly in a group that you wouldn't say from the outset was very tough, with Besiktas and Porto and Leipzig. But I think when we analyse it for what it has been, and when we really look at the players who've gone, Mbappe to Mandi to Bakayoko, you had to rebuild again. And for Monaco, the fact that Jardim's still there and looks like he'll be there to kickstart another cycle is really terrific news.
Yeah, make all the difference to that team, because you think with Fabinho already gone, Lamar's probably outside of the door now. You think that a few more maybe looking onwards as well. At the same time, similar to other seasons where they then went on a resurgence, maybe because of this slight dip, that the things like you think of players like Ronnie Lopez, who's had a tremendous season, but maybe that's gone under the radar because of the fact that they've not quite been as exciting. It's not been shown in Europe as much. Do you think Yuri Tielemans has got another year? Keita Balde has. Maybe they can reinvest some of this money in 3 or 4 more youngsters. They're looking at a few. There was obviously, I think it's with Guri of Lyon and Jordi. Is it Mbula? Yeah, I thought it was Mbula. I just wanted to make sure. He's obviously scoring on the final weekend as well, which was a nice positive. We waited to see a little bit of him. So maybe next season again has the shoots of youth and hope for Monaco yet again. On to Richard's expertise, and that's Rennes, who in the end had a pretty great season, really. There was a few high points. There was a couple of low points where they maybe sort of cantered against sides below them, but at the same time, they've still finished exactly where they really wanted to be in 5th position. They're Rich, just behind the Champions League places. Yes, a fair gap behind them, but at the same time, better than all the rest, relatively comfortably in the end. Great results near the end of the season as well against Paris Saint-Germain, and they seem to have found their formula and their feet this season when it's been relatively inconsistent in other ones. Overall, pretty good.
On it now at season's end, I'd have taken 5th place. If you'd have told me at the start of the season Rennes will finish 5th, Thank you very much. I'd take that deal straight away. They got there the hard way. It was a pretty poor start to the season, the Christian Gourcuff. I think the team continued their recent troubles of really struggling to find an identity, trying to find a settled 11. There was too many chopping and changing players in different positions. One week, a player would be at right back, another they'd be left midfield, and we've had that problem now for sort of three or four years. He stems all the way back to when Montagnier was in charge, and he'd do similar. So something had to change. There was a change at coach. There was a change at president. Sabri Lamouchi, Olivier Leton came in, former PSG director of football. He came in at president level, and they've overseen this move and you can tell the Leton influence on this team, because he's obviously a businessman, but he's a businessman with a footballing mind. And the way that they recruited in January, the way that we are now seeing a settled 11, there is a trust in youth, and it's not just we'll play the youth because an older player or more experienced player is injured or suspended. There's a real trust in youth, and they do now have the real basis and bedrock of a very good team. They recruited a new goalkeeper in the summer. I think he's been one of the league's best in Thomas Kubek. I think he's really been an excellent acquisition. They've got a really young but very exciting centre-back partnership in Joris Gnagnon and Jeremy Jalan, who've both come through the academy, and both look real excellent prospects, both into the French under-21 team recently. They got Benjamin Bourigeaud from Lens. I think has been one of the signings of the season in the whole league. I think the impact he's made, the energy he's brought, the key goals he's provided as well have been excellent out on the right. We brought Wabi Kazri in on loan. He obviously was really struggling with Sunderland and not getting game time and nowhere near the player that we saw for Bordeaux. We brought him back. He's back at his best, and now seems he's going to get a permanent move to somewhere. If it's not us, then bigger. And then you add in, we've got Ismail Assar to really find his top form. Diafra Sakho, I think, has got to find his top form again. Adrian Onu, who's been really, he's faced some really harsh criticism from Rem fans for some pretty lackluster performances, but he popped up at the end of the season with some really crucial goals. So I think I think looking back on it, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, but certainly since Lamouchi came on, it's been a steady incline and an improvement in performances. I think there's still issues to be ironed out. I think when you look over the course of the season, in typical Rennes fashion, we won away at Marseille, we won away at Lyon, we won away in Paris. We lost at home to Caen, we lost at home to Guingamp, we lost at home to Metz. I don't think there's many other teams in the league who could quite have that kind of balance of results. So work to be done, but a really good season. European football, obviously, as well to come. That should hopefully have an impact on the level and quality of signings that we can bring in. So, I'm looking forward to this close season, looking forward to the kinds of players that we can bring in to really build on and hopefully see that the season just gone wasn't a one-off.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one I wanted to focus on there, really, you mentioned a few excellent players, and it's great to see some young players doing well as well. But the one man that stuck out for me and stuck out for many this season, and I know some people might not have heard of him enough, really, and because he's been such a natural, and that's Benjamin Bourigeaud, the 24-year-old. He's scored 10 goals, which is more than anyone in that Rennes side. Very important goals as well, as you've mentioned, Rich, 7 assists as well. He's had really a breakout season, to say the least.
He has. He's an absolute bundle of energy. He works really hard. He's another one that's played in a few positions, but he seems to be settled now out on the right. He's happy to drift into the middle. That's where he's picked up a number of his goals this season. Is sort of poaching in the 6-yard box. So he's a real sort of can-do kind of player. As I say, it's the energy, I think, and the sort of attitude that he has, in that he doesn't stop running, really puts his all in. And yeah, I think really is one of the signings of the season.
Yeah, it's really been tremendous, and credit to Ren for giving them the chance at the top level, because it makes such a difference for these kind of players. On to Nice, who had a great season the season before, obviously finishing third, and the Champions League dream ended relatively quickly. But at the same time, Peter, things started to really unravel. They had a terrible start to the season, and they've sort of slowly picked themselves up, but it always felt like a sort of anticlimactic season with a lot of players looking at the exit door rather than staying. We know Mario Balotelli's looking like leaving, say with Alassane Player, Jean-Michel Seri's looking for the exit door, and Lucien Favre's already gone to Borussia Dortmund, with possibly Patrick Vieira coming in the other way, but we'll wait and see on that one. But it was a final season for most in the end, but at the same time, while they had exceeded expectations by finishing third last season, the fact that they finished outside of Europa League qualification even means that this season they've completely fallen well below expectations.
Yeah, they have, and they can't get away from that. It's been quite a roller coaster of a season in the most extreme senses. You're right; they started so poorly, then they picked up a run of form, and then they hit another slump in form that seemed to drop away, and back up challenging for the Europa League spots, and then have now finished outside it. I mean, there's a number of clubs you could probably stick in that bracket, including Rennes and Bordeaux and Saint-Etienne as well. All of the contenders really have had that sort of up and down, but none more so than Nice. And I think we go back to the very start of the season in the Champions League qualifier, facing Ajax, and then just not making that final hurdle and actually getting into the competition proper. As much as that was a difficult task, the impact of that was it was quite profound in a sense. And I think that the Jean-Michel Seri stuff is definitely part of that. Obviously, he had his move to Barcelona was touted. He's mentioned it himself in his comments that he's made, and then that fell through. He went off the boil, and then their midfield trio that they were, that characterized their fantastic season last year, just wasn't as prolific, was not as effective, and they suffered because of it. Their defensive problems, the defensive vulnerabilities were exposed. None more so than Dante, who looks to be on the wrong side of the 30-year age bracket, as much as we've seen the likes of Helton at 40 performing wonders at Montpellier. He's been a bit exposed. They had problems they couldn't replace. Names escape the left back. And then, that combat, I think back specifically to that game against Lyon at the start of the season, where they were beaten 5-0 at home. And they weren't just beaten, they were run off the park. And I mean, of course, this was a Lyon side performance, but this was a Lyon side without Nabil Fekir. And all of the goals were just example after example of horrendous defending. You had Sorbonne out of position. Suke was playing too far forward. There was no defensive cover from midfield. And that sort of characterized where their season's been. But then on the flip side, there were the upside. There was the upward curves. I mean, above all, Mario Balotelli. And what a fantastic renaissance he's had on the South Coast. And we saw that this season, again, scoring a hat load of goals. Some might say that the way they build around him going forward has been to the detriment of, say, Alassane Player. Of course, when Balotelli was out the side, players come in and he's also exceeded. But, Balotelli's been superb for them, especially in the way he's learnt to control his temperament. He's taken on that role as a big player for them and has, in a sense, pulled them up the table. But at the end of the day, they finished 8th. And, when looking back, building on a side that they didn't really lose too many players compared to last year and their 3rd place finish, there'll be a real sense of disappointment that they're not back in Europe. And for them, it's back to square one. You imagine that Balotelli's going to go. I imagine that some other names will leave as well. And obviously, Favre's gone to Dortmund now. So Vieira's going to start a new project. If it is Vieira, he's got some good assets to work with. Probably won't be Sarri. Looks like he's off as well. But, there's Cyprian coming back. We yet to see the best from him again after injury. So, and at least Milieu as well. Another good player's come in and done well. I think, it's another rebuilding job, I think, for Nice. It's a new chapter, a new page from a season that they'll think was quite disappointing.
It's that attack, isn't it? I think that's going to have to be looked at, because I think Balotelli and Player have both pretty much said that they're off. And between them, they got 34 of Nice's 53 goals this season. So, I mean, if that stat alone doesn't show the importance of not just one replacement, two replacements, and also that they are of a good quality, then I don't know what would.
Yeah, it's really going to be an interesting one for them next season. It's almost like a mini rebuild for them, really. They're going to have to fix the spine of the squad. They're going to have to bring in a brand new manager and possibly a new style of play because of how Lucien Favre likes to play. It's going to be an interesting season to see what they end up doing next season. On to our next team, and with this, we intro in our very own Jeremy Smith. So I wonder which team we'll be previewing in a moment. Good evening to you, Jez.
Hi, how you doing?
Very well, thank you. And obviously, we're going to be talking about Metz, who unfortunately will be leaving us next season. So I don't know why we might call you on again, Jeremy, but hopefully we'll still get a chance on you. But I've noted this on the script, really, that it's a bit of a strange one for Metz this season because they started so poorly that we really expected anything of them. And they sort of kept on teasing us with the Great Escape, only to never really quite doing it off. So it was a somewhat overwhelmingly underwhelming season in the end.
Yeah, that's probably fair. That's probably quite complimentary of their season, to be honest. It started off horrifically. I mean, I think their first match, they took the lead early on against Guingamp and looked extremely comfortable, and then imploded, and that kind of set the template for a lot of their season. Apart from the scoring a goal bit, because I mean, they barely scored again for the next 2 or 3 months. They looked dead and buried, really, by sort of arguably end of November time. And then they really had a sort of a bit of a renaissance around December and particularly January. And it really looked like if they carried on that form, they really could sort of carry out a great escape. And then it all petered out again. And frankly, the fact that they didn't get relegated until, I think, officially only until sort of 2 or 3 weeks before the end of the season, was quite astounding. And I suppose probably you have to put that down to the paucity of a lot of the rest of Ligue 1 this year, because, as I said, apart from that sort of 6-week window, which included a winter break, they did not look great at all. And the amazing thing about the season is when you look at Roux and Dossevy's stats. Roux was among the top scorers. Dossevy was, I think, the third top assister in the whole league. Between them, I think the Dossevy to Roux combination, I think, was only matched by Neymar to Cavani. And it's just horrific to think just how bad the season could have been without those two. They're both almost certainly off, and Metz are going to struggle to, even though they're in one division down, they're going to struggle to match or to come close to matching what those two achieved. And I think also the fact that Metz pretty comfortably went down, really, despite what I said about it only being officialized at the end of the season. The fact that they went down with Dossevy and Roux in such good form says everything you need to know about what was happening behind them, particularly in defence. And when you consider that actually Niakate had a pretty good season in defence and earned a starting place in France's under-21s, it says even more about what was going on around him. So yeah, all in all, a real season to forget. Still ongoing issues between fans and some of the ultra groups and the people in charge. Generally, everyone's very unhappy with Serin, the president. Someone asked me the other day if they said they don't know a lot about Metz. Is it down to the players or is it down to the president? And I said it's down to the president, and then realised that in some cases, or in a lot of cases, when people say that, it's usually because it's some dodgy character who's trying to bleed the club dry and then walk out or whatever. In Metz's case, it's not that at all. I think it's just rank incompetence, basically. And then hopefully they'll be able to bounce back like they have done most seasons recently. I think they've only been in the last something like the last 10 years. They've only stayed in the same division 2 seasons in a row once. So they are very much a yo-yo club. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that they'll go straight back up again. But this one, it does feel like possibly they're going to be in for a good couple of years in Ligue 2, because it does seem quite a mess behind the scenes at the moment.
Yeah, there's a little bit of hope that they can yo-yo back, but it was an interesting season in the end. Like you said, just they started off with that sort of pull back result. There was also that PSG game where for long periods they were pretty competitive until Asu Akoto was sent off, and it sort of derailed from there. And then there was the big long Baron run, and then that weird sort of moment where it felt like the winter break had come at the wrong time, but then they sort of still picked it up in January, and then they still teased us in March and April with a couple of wins that meant points wise, if teams started beating each other, that they might stand half a chance that they maybe drop out of it. But I think also, and I want to get your thoughts on this, that obviously they ended up bringing in Freddie Kantz midway through the season in sort of November time as it was sort of falling away. Do you think that they made that decision to change manager at the top a little bit too late, or do you think that in the end it was the quality in the squad and that eventually saw them down?
I think it's a bit of both. I think he could have been brought in earlier, but he definitely had time to turn things around. As I said, they should have been well out of touch already in December or January, and they weren't. If they carried on the form that they showed in January, they'd have stayed up. Not comfortably, but they could have stayed up. So I think he did have time. It was a very, very difficult job that he was given, and probably he should have come it, or Hinchberger should have gone earlier, which again it really hurts me to say, because Hinchberger is clearly such a good guy and is messed through and through, and probably that is the sole reason why they tolerated him for so long, because it was kind of, you know, a real sort of heart render for everyone involved in the club to get rid of him. But yeah, Hans probably did come in a bit too late, but he still had the time and the capability to turn things around. And yeah, whether it's down to him or the players or the people behind the scenes, I mean, he certainly he hasn't gone into a huge amount of detail, but he has sort of made a few comments which have alluded to the fact that he wasn't given certain things that he was promised, including, for example, I think he wanted a couple more players in January and certainly in different positions. He had a big falling out with Jonathan Cafu at one point in the season, and felt that he wasn't given, that the sort of directors didn't make it clear that they were behind him. And in the end, they did give Cafu a sort of an internal penalty, but a very weak one, which Hans took as a slap in the face. So he could, I think, probably with more time, I do think he probably would have kept them up just, but he had enough with everything else in his favour. He should have had enough time anyway, and just everything about the club this year was a mess, basically. And yeah, he was kind of fighting a losing battle from the moment he came in, I think.
Yeah, and hindsight's always 20/20, isn't it? Sometimes thinking that a little bit extra time might have done them some good, but you never know with these things when teams go down to lead. Sometimes a season there maybe just refreshes things a little bit. On to an interesting mid-table side now in Guingamp, who, Rich, it was a pretty interesting season for them. Really, they sort of maybe dipped a little bit too close to relegation at points. They never really looked like they were going to challenge for Europe at any point, although they had some great performances. You think about back at the season, they had some great games against, you think, to Marseille and Lyon games, but at the same time they were losing to teams at the bottom three. Was it too much of Combare's side being maybe playing too much at other teams' levels rather than maintaining their own standards of lifting themselves for those big games, but also making sure they were professional in those games that they should be winning?
I think my concern with Guingamp is they've rightfully, I think, earned this title of being the sort of plucky underdog who've mixed it with the big teams for a number, more than a couple of seasons now. And I think going into this, into each season, they maintain that. And I think my fear is that an element of complacency of, well, we're the plucky underdog who always stays up. That's my main fear I always have with Guingamp, is that at some point maintaining that attitude will have a detrimental effect on the attitude of the players. And I think there were times this season where we perhaps saw that. It's a very, they've got a pretty senior squad. There's a lot of very experienced players there. Perhaps I think what we saw this season was the real need, I think, for some freshness in the team. I think you saw with the January signing of Clément Grenier, just what he can offer. I think from January to the end of the season, there weren't many, certainly excluding the top four, there weren't many players who were playing as consistently well as him. I thought he's had a real renaissance since moving to Guingamp, and on the back of a few months at Guingamp, it seems that he is going to now get another move, because it seems that he has this 3 million release clause, gentleman's agreement clause, shall we say, in his contract that will allow him to leave for only 3 million. And I still think, as Guingamp have shown this season, you keep him fit, he's still a really, really good player, if only just to take your free kicks. He scored 2 or 3 absolute cracking free kicks for Guingamp. But I think this season, I think there's a danger, I think, of an over-reliance on these senior players who've got obviously a lot of Ligue 1 experience. That's not up for debate. But I think an over-reliance on that and forgetting about the need for a bit of sort of youthful exuberance, if you like, of the freshness and zip that some young players can bring. Because I don't think, we've praised the likes of Marcus Coco and Ludovic Blas for what's felt like 2 or 3 seasons now. I don't quite think they've hit where certainly we have perhaps expected them to go, considering their early promise that they show, although Ludovic Blas did score one of the goals of the season against PSG. So I'm hopeful that over the summer, you can't criticise the job that's been done ultimately. They've stayed in Ligue 1, and that is a great result for this team. But I wish now that they'd perhaps I don't want them to make wholesale changes to their attitude and their approach to the division, because that would have, I think, severe negative consequences. But I just want them to start now, just to tweak, just to start thinking, yes, we are this sort of plucky underdog, tiny town of, season tickets outsell the number, population of the town, and all this, that, and the other. But let's bring a little bit more ambition in. Let's have a bit more self-belief that actually we're more than just that. We are a good footballing team. We are capable of beating, anybody in the division. They play really well against some of the top teams this season. So I'm hopeful that that's what we start to see over the summer, because I think if we have another season of relying on the old guard, it may be a season again where they just flirt with that relegation battle a little bit too close than it's comfortable. So I think a bit of freshness brought into the squad, a sort of rethink of exactly what their identity is and their attitude to that is needed, and I think they'll still be fine next season.
Because that's the difficult thing about sides like Guingamp, isn't it, Peter? That yes, they don't quite have the budget, so you can sort of say that every time they do survive, it's a great deal. But you see, for example, in the Premier League this season, teams that have gone down like Stoke and West Brom that were relative fixtures for 5, 6, 7 years, even 10 years in Stoke's example. But once they start not having a goal to reach, like Guingamp might feel like they've gone, where they feel like they're not really a side that faces great relegation troubles every season, that you do maybe have 1 year where you start stagnating, you start slipping down, and that could be a thing that, although we've probably mentioned it before, to be fair, that might befall them should they not try and find a way to continue moving forward.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we even worried this season that it might happen to them. I think it was just after January and after the winter break, they had that wretched run and that one win. I think it was the Rennes win, and then no wins aside from that in a couple of month period. And there is that potential with Guingamp. I agree definitely about the impetus thing. I think that the impact of Grenier speaks volumes. There is definitely a sense that there needs to be a change, especially in midfield. Diallo's had a great season, but he's getting on a bit now. Dido's 34. They're relying on him, and they brought in some Lebegang Piri in the summer, hoping to freshen up in midfield, and he just wasn't able to compete physically really in Liga. And and as Rich was saying, the young players we've always lauded, we're really yet to see that, and we're really yet to see that consistency. And Comboire loves to rotate; he rotates all the time, and I think that slightly hinders them a little bit. But none of them have taken the scruff of the neck. Not even Saliba, and Saliba's had a really poor season in comparison to the last. I mean, it's not been helped by the double window shenanigans where I think it was Hull before, and then last summer it was Saint-Etienne, and it's just like he's on the verge of leaving, and this time he hasn't come back into play. So there's definitely a sense that they need to reinvigorate their squad a little bit, and obviously resources are an issue. But even Briand, you could say, I mean, he scored 11 goals. He's their top scorer again. He's a great leader, but the impact that he had last year, for example, I mean, they were fantastic at counter-attacking side, really enjoyable to watch. I think we haven't really seen that this year, and part of it's been defensive problems, and there's been rotation at the back. Sorbonne's 34, and he's been dropped in and out for Eboa, but that's sort of unsettled them a little bit. Johnson in goal hasn't been the stable force he used to be. He's had a couple of errors this season as well. So there's little bits that have meant that they haven't progressed as much as we would like them to think. But then at the same time, there's also the sense that expectations are morphed with Guingamp. There is that size. They are a small club. And I think, if they can reinvigorate in the same way that Grenier brought into their attacking play at the very least, then they'll be able to push on again, hopefully. But that risk is always there. But I think with Comboire at the helm, they've got a good manager who's a good leader within the dressing room. That will keep them in check.
They just need to maybe morph a little bit, adapt really more, maybe to survive to go on another season. On to the surprise package, I think we can definitely say for this season, and that's Amiens. Just they performed miracles, many would say, and I don't think you could have thought that last season when they had that moment in the final day of the Ligue 2 season where the very last second they scored that goal that saw them into Liga. That felt like that might be the high point of this season, because many thought that they would be the whipping boys. It would be a very difficult time for them, but other than anything, they've completely supplemented that expectation. They've been tremendous. They've had some really big results. The draw against PSG will live long in the memory of some of their fans, certainly. They finished a solid 13th above teams like Angers and Caen and Lille and Toulouse. It's been a fairy tale for them, hasn't it?
I think they've been fantastic. I mean, certainly one of the most underrated teams in the division, and I think we've all discussed before how Pellissier was very unlucky not to be nominated as one of the coaches of the season. As you said, sort of 96th, 97th minute of the last match of the season, absolutely amazing scenes, and went very, very viral on Twitter, and you sort of thought, well, that's as good as it's going to get for them, and they're going to go straight back down again. Again, just sort of referring a bit to Metz earlier on, they went up 2 seasons in a row from the National and kept more or less the same team, and it was too much for them. It was a young team, but the jump from National to Ligue 2 was one thing, but from Ligue 2 to Ligue 1 was too much. So I don't think there were many people at all who were expecting Amiens to have a chance to stay up. But not only have they stayed up relatively comfortably, and not only has it been comfortable, but for the most part, it's been playing decent football as well. And you just look through the whole team, that there's just a really good spine there of Gertner in goal. You've got players like Dibassi in defence. You've got Monconduit, I think, has been a really good. I was going to say workhorse, but that's a bit unfair. But the kind of player that any team needs. Someone who's going to work really hard and get stuck in midfield. You've got Kakuta, who was one of those artists formerly known as the next Zidane, who never really went anywhere with his career, but has really had a fantastic season as the main playmaker and I guess the talisman of the team. You've got Konate scoring the goals, and also you kind of have to remember that they lost Ndombele earlier in the season, who we've seen what a great player he's been already for Lyon this year. he I think probably first came to a lot of people's attention when he had a man of the match performance for Amiens against PSG before he even moved to Lyon. So to lose a player like that, any team you'd think would struggle to lose a player like Ndombele, but Amiens have seamlessly sort of moved on and done, as I said, a lot better than I think anyone could have dreamed of, and certainly there was an incident off the pitch with the problems with the stadium against Lille, and the president not acting as well as he might have done, but certainly on the pitch, I think they've only gained friends this season.
Yeah, absolutely. Hats off to them, and we'll be delighted to see them next season.
I think the other thing that will go perhaps unnoticed is just that it's that defence. Fourth best defence in the division. Only PSG, Montpellier, and Nantes conceded fewer goals, which for a newly promoted team containing, as Jez said, many players who were in the third tier, 3 seasons ago, I think is absolutely incredible. So looking forward to seeing what happens next year.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing to take away. I think it's much harder to do that kind of record than score lots of goals. Being a very solid defensive team when coming up is a really, really tough thing to do, especially for a lot of sides that make it into bigger leagues. And credit to them, credit to Pelissier, who's been tremendous and should have really got that award, let's be honest. On to one of my favourite teams this season, even though they were sort of a mid-table side, but they really cut the mustard for me and many people. Was Dijon, but they had a terrific home record this season, which no one really wanted to face them at home, and at the same time as well, a couple of players that you might want to watch out for the World Cup. Thinking of players like Kwon and Naim Sliti, who had both tremendous seasons for a side that played attacking football and entertaining football on a weekly basis, and sometimes that's something we maybe take for granted in some leagues, but in Ligue 1 especially, an attacking team is maybe a little bit of a rarity.
Absolutely. I think just to go back on that, I think Kwon, fantastic player, probably up there with one of Dijon's best. I think he's picked up an injury actually, which has ruled him out of the World Cup. So, as horrible as that is for him, from a Dijon perspective, they would hope to see the positive from obviously a very bad, sad situation for the player, but that may see him at least stay with Dijon, certainly for the first half of next season, because he was excellent. A real standout player, and especially because he wasn't. Many times he was popping up, coming off the bench. So to hit double figures without actually having a secure regular starting spot, I think was a real testament to how well he played. But no, Dijon as a whole, I think they were another team. I think that perhaps went beyond many people's expectations. I think a lot of people would have had them as another one to really be struggling to avoid relegation all season, and that really hasn't particularly been the case. I think at one point, certainly earlier in the year, they were flirting with the potential possible idea of even finishing within a European spot. So it's been an absolutely fantastic season for them. I think what has underpinned it has been that home form. I think that has been terrific. Only the teams that finished in the top 4 took more points from their home games than Dijon, and it's it's that old adage, isn't it? As a team, if you're not going to be one of the big boys, it's at least make your home ground a really difficult place for teams to come, and that's exactly what Dijon have done. There's been some big teams that have gone there and have been completely overwhelmed by how well Dijon play. They're not a sit back and allow teams to come on. They're keen to get forward. I don't think necessarily their final goal tally would show that, but they are quite an attacking team. They are perhaps a little focused and a bit too reliant on 2 or 3 players. I think they'd like to share that workload out a little bit. But it's been a fantastic season. I've enjoyed seeing them. They seem to always take part in entertaining games for one reason or another. So again, they're another team that I'm looking forward to seeing if they can kick on another gear next season.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be interesting to see where the chips sort of lie for them next season, heading into another interesting campaign. On to a team that certainly will interest English audiences, especially because he's leaving now, at least anyway. And that's Claudio Ranieri's Nantes' one solo season at the club, Peter Leclerc. It was started so well. It seemed like he'd maybe helped buoy this side from the terrific end it had under Sergio Conceição and fighting for Europe, but it just slowly petered away. The relationship between him and the president, Waldemar Keita, just faded at the same time as well. It always looked like it was just straining to the point of breaking, and it did in the end. And there's potential rumours that there was supposedly Jocelyn Gourvenec heading on a flight to Nantes earlier today, so maybe he might be the one taking the step now. But looking back at Ranieri's year, it went very similar to his tenure of Leicester. Sorry, the 2 seasons of it. It went quite high for a while, but then slowly dipped back into it. But at the same time, it was much more of a classic Ranieri side than that exciting title-winning side with Leicester.
Yeah, it was definitely a classic Ranieri, and if you were to compare it to Leicester, it'd be like the whole of his time at Leicester condensed into a season. He did start so well, and and that showed the signs of Ligue 1's a place to be, for renaissance for players and managers too. And there was certainly an element to that, and we saw a side that was capable of grinding out results, firm defensively. He built from the back as he's always done, and would nick the odd goal and would pick up points. And they were in 5th in pole position for a Europa League spot for the majority of the campaign. And to finish where they had done, it's really, really disappointing from his perspective and for the club. Obviously with Ranieri, there was the talk of him being linked with the Italy job. The surprisingly open when it came to that as well. And obviously with Waldemar Keita is not one to shy away from media conversations either. I think on the whole for Nantes, they've got to be pleased with the basis they've got. I think there have been some fantastic standout performers, especially defensively. I think picking up Palois, for example, was a great addition. Dubois has really come on and shown himself to be a leading light at fullback too. I think Tatarusanu, of course, has been their signing of the season. You could possibly say in goal has been something of a revelation, and I think there was also that side to it in those early days when they were picking up those narrow margin results, that they were relying on him especially to make some fantastic stops, holding up their back line of Carlos and Lima. And I think it's kind of, especially when we just come off Dijon. I mean, the contrast between the two is so profound that it's quite nice that it's quite fitting. Not nice. Nice is definitely the wrong word about what I'm about to say. That Nantes did fall away a little bit, and we did see the more attacking sides making the mark for Europe next season. Because if you think about from thinking a bit more broadly here on a brand perspective, Nantes and the way Ranieri was playing going into Europe, it doesn't carry the same appeal and pizzazz that you would want from a side going and being an ambassador for the league in a sense. But yeah, I think the way the season panned out was disappointing. To finish where they did, finish outside the European spots, especially when as we've mentioned already, the way that sides like Rennes and Nice, and we'll talk about Saint-Etienne and Bordeaux later, have just had those massive fluctuations, and Nantes were there. They were the staple, and they were firm. They were holding out, and then they just started to drop points. Those 1-0 wins started to dry up. They became 0-0s, and then there were sloppy goals being conceded, and then we see the Ranieri-ness sort of contract on itself, and that's how it's ended up, unfortunately. So it's a real shame on that part. But yes, for Ranieri, how would you score him? I guess that's the question. And I think, especially after Leicester, you would hope that it was be the nice. He talked about the Breton breeze, giving him a new sense of life and whatever else, but it hasn't really worked out like that. The rain's got to him a little bit.
Maybe a 5 out of 10 if you're maybe being a little bit kind, but Jez, at the same time, maybe it highlights the job that Conceição did really, that this squad maybe wasn't really strong enough, and Ranieri, to give him some credit at least anyway, got quite a bit out of that squad in the first half of the season, when in fairness there wasn't too much of a team to deal with, because we do cast our mind back to sort of the midpoint of the 16-17 season that this Nantes team was near relegation, and the Portuguese man really lifted them out of the gutter. So for Ranieri to continue that, at least for a time, maybe a bit of a testament to how well he was, and how much, again, that Nantes maybe need to reinvest in the summer.
I think it certainly shows that the players there have got some kind of ability, and I don't know if it's that, compared to others, there's certain limitations in it, and it takes a good manager to bring the best out of them, or maybe, I'm not going to say attitude problems, but maybe there's players that need a certain kind of man management to push them to their best. Because, as you said, halfway through last season, they looked a mess. Conceição did a brilliant job, sort of doing more than a recovery. It looked like he was, had he stayed, they'd have really been set to have a good season this year. I think it was a big pity he didn't stay. There was an interview with one of the non-players, I can't remember who, this week, where he was really sort of singing Conceição's praises and saying how devastated that the changing room was when he announced that he was leaving. And then, as Peter said, the first half of this season under Ranieri looked excellent, possibly not as entertaining to watch as Conceição's team, but defensively extremely strong and able to get those results. And then they fell away again, which, again, drawing on the sort of Leicester experience, maybe says something about Ranieri. And I don't know if it's that, not a soft touch, but it seemed like, with Leicester the first year, with all the stuff about the pizzas, when buying pizza for the team when they kept a clean sheet, and then it seemed maybe he was kind of too pally with the team. I don't know if that's what happened with Nantes as well, but it did follow the same pattern, and you do feel that there's a talented team there waiting to do something if they have the right boss. It sounds like Gourvenec's going to be that boss. He's obviously coming off not the greatest experience in the end of Bordeaux. I really hope that he manages to do something with Nantes, because I'm a big fan of his. But I do worry that it felt like he lost the changing room at Bordeaux, and I wonder if they need someone who sort of has, let's say, more of an iron fist than Gourvenec seems to have, just to sort of keep them on the right sort of wavelength or the right path. I hope it works out, because they've got such a great heritage. They're such a great club within French football, but it does feel like there's been a few too many wilderness years, and the constant changes in coaches I don't think it's helping them at all. And a lot of the team is still quite young, and I don't think they're being given the chance to really develop, because of the fact that each year or even twice a year they're coming under different leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be interesting to see what direction they do go in, should Gourvenec be the man to get the job. We're at the halfway stage now, so this is where we say adieu to Rich, Peter and Jez. Thank you, all of you, for joining us this evening. Enjoy the rest of your time and your summer off.
Thanks very much, ET.
And at this point, with our half-time oranges in our mouths, we're going to introduce two substitutes in, and what better ones to bring on? It's almost like bringing on Gareth Bale at the Champions League final as well. It's bringing on, yeah, he's giggling right there. We've got our very own Adam White and the returning Eric Devin as well for this second half, and some terrific teams. And we're going to start with your side, Eric, in Lyon, who have had a sort of ebbed and flowed season, really. They started terrifically. They had that big dip sort of January, February time where we were questioning whether they would really challenge for Champions League or if they were drifting away, and they slowly built back into it after they fell out of the Europa League and have ended up with an automatic Champions League space, which was the goal really at the start of the season. Does that mean this season was a success?
I think it was a season of hints at success. I think that there were a lot of questions, obviously, last summer, given the amount of flux that Lyon's squad had. The departures of Gonalon, Lacazette, Tolisso, and Valbuena had left Lyon shorn of almost all their attacking talent. Even Fekir, he was staying, yes, but his attitude, his fitness was a big question mark. There were a lot of questions and surprise even when Genesio made him captain. And the players they brought in, certainly going back to Depay, but Adrien Traore, Mariano, Ferland Mendy, Tanguy Ndombele, these players had been looked at as being bright prospects, but were they yet of the caliber, were they already at that level, that is to say, to bring Lyon back in the Champions League? So I think that the fact that they did achieve that is certainly success, but I also have to wonder how much better this team could have done in the Europa League. How much could this team have maybe given PSG a little bit more to think about in terms of the title? And I know they finished quite a way back and behind Monaco as well, but I think a lot of this was down to depth and planning. That last dip you mentioned there in January and February, I do think that being so reliant on such a cadre of young players, that is to say, Aouar, Ndombele, Toussaint in midfield in particular, but also players a little bit older, looking at Jeremy Morel in particular, it's difficult to balance that sort of squad without the necessary depth. And I think that Lyon could have had a better season, both domestically and in Europe, had they plumped to add a few more players. Looking particularly at another center back, I think we've seen Mukhtar Diakabi. I hope it pans out for him, but I get a feeling that this player is just really not ready for prime time. He was terrible again in the under-21s in their friendly against Switzerland the other day, and we saw that match near the end of the season where he was culpable for really all 3 goals, if you want to look at it that way. And I just feel like investment in another defensive midfielder to give Toussaint cover, to allow him to be rested when there's a chance for that, and to have a third quality center back would have allowed Lyon to have a much better season. Would they have won the Europa League? I'm not saying that, no, but I'm saying losing in the manner that they did to Cesca was really disappointing. And I think really, even with that late surge and the surge in form in terms of Traore and Depay towards the end, is great to see and gives me a lot of hope for next season. But this team has clear areas in which they need to invest. So should we be happy? Yes, but should we be cautious? Yes, as well, especially with Fekir potentially on the way out.
And that's really been the story this season, hasn't it, Eric? The 2 players really in each half, really. Fekir, especially in the first half of the season, probably the best player in Ligue 1, and then again a little bit of a knock sort of soured railed him, and then it was maybe difficult for him to fully get back into the flow of things quite at the level that he was. But then the person who stepped up, especially in the last couple of months in the season, was Memphis Depay, who at the same time we've mentioned at times that he could get distracted. He tried a little bit too much, but this season Genesio maybe did the right thing of pulling him out the side when he needed to, saying that he wasn't ready for these big games because he wasn't good enough defensively. He'd come on and score the winning goal in a couple of them, but didn't quite have the impact that he wanted. But at the same time, in the last 2 months especially, that for the Dutchman, who was the one I want to focus on really, he's been tremendous, and possibly should Fekir go, he should be their main focal point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing to take away from this, too, is that he's playing a role that I think suits him a little bit more. He's given a little bit more freedom. Now, the reason he initially struggled, Lyon started the season playing a 4-2-3-1 with Fekir as the 10 and Depay playing out wide. Now, can he have success there? Yes, but it's limited because, again, tactically playing a 2-man midfield and with Fekir ahead of those 2, it does require Depay to track back and to work a little bit harder to get the best out of the likes of Lyon's left backs, Mendy and Marçal. And I think that he did struggle with that. There's no doubting his attacking talent. Even his raw numbers from last season, that is 2016-17, after joining Lyon, were still fairly impressive, despite being a half season. But I think that playing him as he's been used in the recent past by Lyon, that is partner with Traore and at the head of a 4-3-1-2, has gotten the best out of him because it allows him freedom from defensive responsibility and a freedom to pick and choose his spots on the pitch as befits his style of play. And I think that as much as Lyon fans would like to slag off Genesio for some questionable tactical decisions he's made in the past, I think that switch back to that diamond, which, again, we should recall did so well for them in 2014-15, really has made all the difference in Depay's form. And that of Traore as well. I believe he scored 10 or 11 goals in the second half of the season. So he's a player who's also really come on under that system as well. So really a massive credit to Genesio for being adept enough tactically to get the best out of these two players, particularly Depay, who, I think were it not for Neymar's reputation, would probably have deserved a place in the Ligue 1 team of the season.
Yeah, and you think now with those players maybe coming to the fore late that it does soften the blow of Fekir possibly leaving, with Mariano Diaz getting plenty of goals and maybe adding another player to that mix, maybe just gives them a little bit extra for next season, and a team that will be certainly looking towards next season and hoping they're still in a Ligue 1 side, really, even at this point. Adam, is Lille, who've had, quite frankly, really, and I think this is putting it kindly, have had an awful season, really. It could still get worse because the DNCG might still automatically relegate them. We sort of wait for them to absolutely confirm Lido's status in the Liga next season. But at the same time, it took those 3 games in the end of the season, those 3 victories to keep them up. And it's a good job they did, because on the final day of the season, they were beaten 5-1 and only finished 2 points above Toulouse in the end. And obviously, if they wouldn't have picked up 3 points elsewhere, they would have been in the relegation playoff themselves. But there was a lot of changing in the summer last time. It factors in that there's probably going to be a bit more changing to come this summer, given that this season has been essentially a write-off.
Yeah, I think it really has been a bit of a write-off. And when you look at their sort of medium-term future, it really looks pretty bleak. The DNCG are scheduled to make their the meeting with Gerard Lopez tomorrow morning, whether they're going to hand down a relegation style punishment as they have in the past if he isn't able to meet this sort of 25 million euro deficit that started at 40 million. But the sale of Martin Terrier in the January window sort of made a bit of a dent on that 15 million, but they've still got to make up this 25 million sort of gap. And whether that they've been able to do that since not being able to buy players in the January transfer window themselves is really open to debate. And we could be this time tomorrow talking about Lille in Ligue 2 and Lille in real trouble of further financial issues and being demoted further, possibly. I don't know, that the DNCG could be extremely strict. So it's a bit of the future is pretty much open for Lille. And you look at their next sort of 6 months, and if they stay in Ligue 1, you're sort of thinking, what are the best and what are the worst case scenarios? Worst case scenario, obviously, is they get relegated, and that they perhaps even get relegated further. They drop down the divisions, as has happened with other clubs. But even the other end of the spectrum, you look at their best case scenario. I don't see Lopez going anywhere, and should he stay, which I imagine he will, if they stay in Liga, they don't really have the cash to develop the squad, and it's an extremely young team. And you look at sort of Kevin Malqui and Ibrahim Amadou and Thiago Mendes as the senior players, and they're all sort of 25, 26. So they need experience. So you can imagine that the best they can hope for is that they sign some free agents, some experienced Ligue 1 players, which has been discussed a lot, particularly Luis Campos, to say they needed that experience that they sort of cut away quite dramatically last time under Bielsa. So they'll be looking to bring in a few experienced heads, maybe sell 1 or 2 more players. But the promise that Gerard Lopez bought when he purchased Lille, 18 months ago now, has completely evaporated, and it doesn't look like sort of returning anytime soon. And yeah, it could genuinely get worse even if they stay in Ligue 1 next season, because the chance to develop the quality of the squad is pretty minimal. So it's tough times ahead for Lille, and tomorrow is their kind of D-Day, if you like. If they do manage to overcome this DNCG investigation, if you like, then even then they've still got a lot of battles to fight between now and the end of next season. So bleak times ahead, and I don't really see it getting too much better even if they do stay in Ligue 1.
That's the thing. If they do stay in Ligue 1, it almost has to be sort of a soft reset, essentially, of maybe selling Amadou finally, if some teams are still interested at the price they were in January. You think that maybe the second half of the season Nicolas Pepe had with scoring goals and finally finding his feet, that maybe there might be interest again in him to get themselves some money, and essentially using those 3 million, 4 million, 5 million pound deals from those sort of sales where you're expecting 15 million plus, and really try and retool this squad as somewhere with more Ligue 1 experience, maybe with getting those young players a little bit of freedom and a little bit more less pressure than they clearly had this season that sort of suffocated them for long periods of the season. But like you say there, Adam, there's a big deadline coming up for them, and it'll be a big day ahead for them. That they hope that the DNCG don't come with the big hammer that they sometimes usually do when they talk to Ligue 1 clubs. But onto a side that again we'll have a few of these in the second half. Really had a topsy-turvy season, really, Eric, in Bordeaux. They were a side that we mentioned at the start of the season under Gourvenec, had maybe a chance of fighting for Europe. It completely dramatically backfired on him. The first half of the season was abysmal. There was some great moments right near the start where Malcolm looked like he was going to be an unbelievable world beater. The whole team fell off the cliff. There was the strange Brazilian contingent and the social media issue that they had there. They ended up bringing in Gus Poyet, which felt like a bit of I know from some quarters, a bit of a joke appointment, really, in some eyes, but he's rebuilt. He had that sort of flash when he first took over, and then they regressed again. But then all of a sudden, a search late on, probably because also the middling sides around them sort of not quite grasping it themselves, and they've sort of surged eventually into the Europa League for next season, which might not necessarily be as good as it might sound. But what happened under Gus Poyet that really transformed that, and especially that last sort of 5, 6, 7 games where they really surged up the table against arguably teams they should be beating, but at the same time, a tremendous turnaround for them to get European football again.
Yeah, I think it was just a matter of Poyet having younger players to work with. I think that the faith he's put in, we look at Jules Koundé, I think he's definitely the standout in that regard, but also giving more of an opportunity to Solio Mete, who came in on loan from Monaco. I think that he made a big difference by adding a little bit more dynamism to that midfield. Leurier, the Danish midfielder, is a decent player, but I think he's a little bit more prosaic, whereas Mete, I think, adds a little bit more to that team going forward. So I think allowing that team to be more forward-thinking, but also, trusting in players who, might not have had a chance. And Yaroslav Palacio also started quite a bit down the back end of the season. I think that's someone who's surprisingly made a difference. I know even at 36 years old, he did really well. And also banishing a player like an Otavio, who, we barely saw anything of. Same thing with Jonathan Cafu. Players who Poyet didn't think were making the grade, he was pretty quick to dispense with them. In some regards, that was a little bit surprising. Look particularly at maybe Valentin Bada, who had an excellent season last season, but has sort of been persona non grata this season. So I think Poyet, simply his fiery nature, which will be well known to people in the UK, but I think also his ability to make tough calls about players who aren't willing to submit to his methods and fall in line, for lack of a better phrase. I think that he instilled in Bordeaux a sort of grittiness and a drive that maybe had been a little bit lacking, I think, particularly under Gourvenec, as we saw them be a bit more of a flair side. But I think that Bordeaux, at their best in the run-in, were definitely a little bit more imposing, a little bit more physical. Thinking also about having Pablo come back in, a player that most thought would never feature for the club again after leaving on loan, and the issues of attitude that surrounded him. So, yeah, really making the best of the circumstances. I mean, I don't want to. The other thing I should say here is that I don't want to hang too much on Bordeaux making the Europa League. That could have been Nice. That could have been Saint-Etienne. It was really, they were really the best of a mediocre bunch of the sides that were contending for that. But that said, well done considering where they were when Poyet came in to further develop some of these young players and also have this team have a personality, which I think that they didn't for large stretches of the beginning of the season. Even doing so well in that first half dozen matches or whatever it was before the loss to PSG, I still don't think that Bordeaux necessarily had an identity. And I think that that's something we did see this team come into. The Europa League, I do want to say, yeah, blessing in disguise. Also, if Malcolm leaves, that does allow them to get perhaps a jump on their season and to get into decent form by the time the Ligue 1 rolls around. If they get a decent draw, they should be able to progress to the group stages without too much of an issue. But I mean, there are some, Rangers, for example, are an unseeded potential opponent in that second qualifying round they could be placing. So it might be a little bit harder, easier said than done for Bordeaux, rather, in the Europa League. But I think there's a lot to look forward to from this team going forward, particularly if that money that is made from that potential sale of Malcolm is wisely reinvested in similarly young attackers.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing going forward. I mean, we mentioned them qualifying for Europa League last season, and they sort of managed to throw it away quite early, and hopefully that they don't befall the same fate of sort of being maybe a little bit too arrogant in those qualifying stages. And at the same time, I do wonder if whether it feels like Malcolm would go, but at the same time, it feels like for what money and what club will come in for him at the moment. It does seem like maybe because he sort of quietened down after such a fast start that it might be a little bit of an interesting one to keep an eye on. On to the other team that really was Jekyll and Hyde this season, maybe is the best way to put it, Adam. And that's Saint-Etienne. Ligue were especially after the 5-0 thrashing against Lyon, where Oscar Garcia decided to leave. They were sort of in free fall for a long while before the winter break, and Jean-Louis Gasset eventually sort of got them slowly going with a couple of shrewd January moves and players starting to finally find their feet and find a rhythm. They played some really great football really at the end of the season through Hamouma and Kabele. They had a few really good results and started scoring goals, which feels like a world away for a Ligue side. But at the same time, they almost made Europe. They just missed out in the end really, and it was a tough ask for them at the same time. But I think my question really is we mentioned at the end of last season that obviously Christophe Galtier was leaving. It was a chance for them to try something new. But at the same time, the fact that he did have a sustained success at a certain level with a certain style for so long, did that end up hurting them a little bit more this season? And then next season might be the time where they maybe push back to where we might have hoped they would be this season?
Quite possibly. I think it's a really interesting point because, given that his tenure was 8-9 years, perhaps, you see it with other clubs in that, after a long managerial stint, which is obviously quite uncommon these days. It's not sort of 20 or 30 years ago when 8-9 years in charge of a club was pretty commonplace. After a manager after a long stint leaves, you get a little bit of a hangover, a bit of a downturn, and clubs can struggle in the wake of that sort of the ending of an era, if you like. And for Saint-Etienne and Galtier, it certainly was an ending of an era. Galtier took them from relegation threatened to European regulars over the course of those sort of 8 seasons, and which he did a fantastic job. I think, though, that the hangover from Galtier wasn't necessarily, that kind of, that may perhaps a sort of hangover that fills that kind of box of, the end of an era. It was almost from the way he set up the team and the club. Galtier is sort of infamously, or whichever way you look at it, famously perhaps, is a very sort of conservative and astute coach, and he doesn't necessarily, or in fact very rarely, especially in the last 4 or 5 years of his stay at Saint-Etienne, produce attacking football or look to play particularly expansively. He gets the best out of what became over those seasons, starting with players like Aubameyang, Matuidi, Payet was there for a bit. They had some very good players to start with, but by the end, it was a very mediocre squad and a very uninspiring squad and a squad that lacked creativity. But he was still finishing, top 6, top 8 quite comfortably and challenging for the Champions League in sort of 2 or 3 years ago. And, when Oscar Garcia came in, he had an okay start and it sort of trailed off. And that Lyon defeat obviously was a huge, huge confidence, blow. And, the club looked completely sort of desolated after that. But they kind of struggled to recover from the fact that the squad that he'd sort of assembled was actually really quite run-of-the-mill and on paper wasn't really a top half Ligue 1 side. So especially with players like Hamouma and like Parang getting older, it was one that wasn't just sort of average, it was sort of on the wane as well. So for Saint-Etienne to recover from that was always going to be difficult. And obviously the circumstances surrounding Oscar Garcia made it even more difficult because over the winter in particular, they just looked completely destroyed. That 5-0 defeat to Lyon, the circumstances in which it occurred and the fact that Garcia left and, brought Julian Sabler in and he didn't really have much impact. You could see that he was a little bit out of his depth and, of course, didn't have the right sort of qualifications, and Gasset was sort of waiting in the wings and sort of helping along before actually taking over. There was a defeat to Bordeaux, I seem to remember. They were in the middle of the season. They lost 3-0. I remember Mendy scored a couple of really good goals, which is a pretty rare occurrence in itself. They just looked like a defeated team, and it was a bit like Lille did for some parts of the season. And I was struggling to see how they were going to get out of this slump. And I think for their season as a whole, huge credit has to go to Jean-Louis Gasset. It wasn't going to be an overnight fix for them. It was something that he slowly gave the team confidence. He slowly worked his ideas into the way they played. And as you said, by the end of the season, they were playing some good football. and they were scoring goals, which is, very un-Gautier-like. So it was always going to take a long time to get over that Gautier reign in a number of respects, but they manage it, and I think Gasset deserves huge credit. Just looking at just one final point on that, just looking at the end of the season, from the 27th of January when they beat Caen 2-1, then they lost twice until the end of the season, and those were in 2 of the last 3 games. They went sort of 13, 14 games undefeated in Ligue 1, which is really quite impressive considering where they were to start with. So huge credit to Gasset, and they might finally move on from Gautier 100% next season.
And that's the interesting thing as well, with potential new owners on the horizon, rumours of that, American investors possibly looking at the club, and the fact that they might not have Gasset as their manager, they may plump for someone else as well. Does leave a little bit of intrigue for next season for Saint-Etienne, and seeing where they might head next, whether it will be another charge for European places. On to Strasbourg, who in the end did what they needed to do in terms of staying in Ligue 1, really, Eric, because that was their main goal, and then hopefully for the following season to sort of consolidate that and start to build the way with a new stadium and everything like that, and work that way and become a more stable Ligue 1 club. But the thing that impressed me this season, other than the stalwart really of Dimitri Léonard popping up at the big moments, was the fact on the big night, Strasbourg were the team to do the big performance. You think back to the game at home to Marseille, especially at home at least anyway, the win against Paris Saint-Germain as well, which was a real shocker, and the one that did finally see them safe against Lyon. Now, they went on a terrible run really in the second half of the season, but at the same time, when it mattered, they came big.
Right. I also don't think that we should undersell that injuries took their role in this to some extent. Kenny Lala, who has been, I think, one of their better players this season, missed some time. So did Aoulou, so did Leonard, and I don't think we undersell that. Benjamin Cornier, Martin Terrier. I think that you'll find, if you look back in terms of fitness and suspension, when players were missing for Strasbourg, I think that was really an issue there. Nuno da Costa missed a handful of matches as well, if I recall correctly. But yeah, I think really a creditable first season back in the division. Thierry Loret deserves an immense amount of credit for not only having this team playing well, but also playing forward-thinking football. And I think that, even if we look at the departures, they're likely to suffer this season. They sold Isan Sako in the winter window. Terrier, of course, is going to be with Lyon next season. Aoulou has been linked with a move away as well. I still think there's a lot to be said for his aesthetics, for his gumption in terms of sticking to his choices and keeping this team playing positively when that might necessarily be the obvious option for Strasbourg. And it was eventually, as you rightly say, a very tight race to stay afloat. So yeah, I think a massive amount of credit to the manager, a massive amount of credit to the transfer team there as well for bringing in players that might have been sort of cast-asides. Bakary Kone, I think, had a decent season as well, who might not have always been the obvious choice, but might be, but might have had something to prove, as it were. They've been linked recently, I think, on the GFN Twitter feed today, with Yohan Pele to replace the combination of Camara and Okija in goal. I think that could be a step up. I'm not saying this team's going to struggle or going to contend for Europe, but I think that having Loret at the reins next season and keeping a decent amount of these players, with his ability to not only improve players, but to offer a kind of positive football that could be attractive to players who might be looking elsewhere, I think is a really good combination for this club. And of course, they have great fan support every time watching a match being broadcast. There, I was always taken with that as well. So yeah, very, very solid season for Strasbourg. There's nothing to really complain about. Perhaps they did have it end up being a little bit closer than they would like, but I think there's a lot to be said for the way that this team collectively and individually came on as the season progressed. So well done.
And again, we've mentioned it a few times this season. It's nice for a team coming up from Ligue 2 to have a plan about how they want to be a team in Ligue 1, because even Ligue 1 teams don't sometimes have some kind of plan. At least Strasbourg have that idea. They're thinking, well, we want a better stadium. We want to keep attracting the great fans that we have, and creating that atmosphere. We want to be a stable side that can produce their own players as well as attract some extras. And it'll be interesting to see how they try and move on to what would be stage 2 of their Ligue 1 adventure next season. On to another side that have had a surprising season to many, given that last season they did struggle for long periods, Adam, and that's Montpellier. They've been incredible defensively, no doubt about it this season. But at the same time, will there be a little bit of a tinge of disappointment that they were in those Europa League places and in around there for such a long time to sort of dip themselves out and finish in 10th in the end? Maybe a little bit of disappointment, but at the same time, at the start of the season, I'm pretty certain they would have bitten your hand off for mid-table after the season before.
Yeah, I really think they would have bitten your hand off after their last campaign where they finished 15th and were, only just sort of scraped out of the relegation zone in the last sort of towards the end. They lost the last 5 games, but they were pretty close to getting in trouble there. For Montpellier this season, I think the issue is the manager. I mean, that sounds extremely harsh, given that he has done a really good job, Machado Zakaria, and he's very good at organising and drilling his players. But I think that Montpellier have Montpellier fans anyway, probably pretty quickly realised the limitations of a Zakarian team. And I think when he was at Nantes, they finished 14th twice in a row on him, and were bottom scorers and second bottom scorers to Troyes when they had that nightmare year, and that he has struggled to find a formula that allows his teams to play expansive attacking football as well as maintaining any sort of semblance of the defensive acumen, and that really came to a head with Montpellier this season, because they were never a team to take the initiative. They were never a team to take the game by the scruff of the neck and look for the victory and attack and go and win a game. And I think that really speaks from looking at their overall record, and in a pretty sort of, it's a pretty reductionist way to look at it, but 18 draws over 38 games, nearly half of the games were draws, and obviously the second best defence in the league, only conceding 33 goals, but only scoring 36 as well. There's only 2 more than Metz, who finished bottom. Toulouse scored more goals than they did. So I think that for Montpellier, it's going to be, or at least for the Zakarian, you may see his tenure at Montpellier play out in a similar way to did at Nantes when they came up, and obviously that hasn't happened to Montpellier, but they were sort of in a similar sort of position, and where mid-table, is good, is given their season last year, it's pretty decent, and they'll take that. But will they ever get anywhere beyond 10th, 9th? I mean, probably not. And I think that you may see the unfortunate situation that there's a current experience in Nantes, where they have a very similar season next year. They're very defensive. They're very difficult to beat. The top sides, drop points to them, but they won't go looking to win games. And even if they do compete for Europe, which, to be honest, carries the caveat this year, the fact that no one really wanted to take those 5th and 6th places, and it was all pretty even behind the top 4. And that stands out by the fact that Montpellier drew so many games in the second half of the year. They only actually won 2 of their last 14, which says quite a lot of the fact that they were still in contention coming into the last few weeks of the year. So next season, I can see them having a very similar year, and then Zakarian, perhaps the third season, he's expected to push on a bit if that's what Montpellier fans and the Montpellier hierarchy expect, and challenge for Europe and progress the club. And I don't know that he's got the capacity to do that, which is a real shame, because you can't argue with how good he is defensively. But for a team that, again, like Nantes, who, although not one of the big 4 or necessarily one of the top 6, are a team that look to progress, he might find that very difficult, and I can't see how Montpellier progress under him, unfortunately. And I think just one final point on that was with Reims in Ligue 2. They won the league by a country mile this year, but last year they only finished 6th or 7th under the Zakarian, and it kind of shows that even with a team that's expected to go and win a league, he struggled. So good coach, very defensive, but probably not enough to progress the club.
And that's the interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, they've had a tremendous defensive record. They only conceded 4 more than Paris Saint-Germain, who barely had to defend in half the games this season, really. But like you say, 36 goals, that's matched by Nantes. It's only been beaten, really, quote unquote beaten, because you can't really beat for less goals. But Troyes and Metz were the team sides that have ended up going down in this season. You do feel that with Montpellier possibly losing someone like Jerome Roussillon, who was one of their main creative forces, really, that they might need to try and find a way to counter better if they are going to stay under Des Zakarian. Onto a team that had a bit of a tricky season, really, Eric. That Angers looked like they were going to be struggling for long periods of the season. They were well down there up until the sort of final few months of the season, and a great run that combined with Stéphane Moulin getting a new contract with the club, which is kind of a reverse move to what we see with many times that are struggling down the bottom of league tables. But they managed to drag themselves out of trouble with a combination of pure will and Carl Tucker Kambe obviously helping themselves as well. But that trust in Moulin and giving him that new contract and the belief that he's done it a couple of times before for them, really eventually combined that with the team that they had, saw them through.
Yeah, I think this has been an interesting season. Obviously, Angers last summer turned a profit, as they always do, with the sales of Pepe and Diédhiou. But they had made some significant reinvestment last season, bringing in the likes of Crivelli, Baptiste Guillaume, Thomas Torre. And those three in particular, none of them really panned out. Las Koulibaly from Bastia was more of a mixed bag. Fulgini had a good season. But again, things didn't go as this club expected. I think that the club's hierarchy in investing, I think they had a net spend, it must have been north of £10 million, a decent amount for a club of Angers' level. But things didn't really work out. The club were in a bit of a bind. Romain Thomas was out of form as well. There was an issue with their goalkeepers as well. But Moulin, made the necessary changes, dropping players when he needed to, making changes for injury, and continued to improve players as he has time and time and time again. Carl Toko Ekambi is the latest example, but we've seen that with Diédhiou, with Cheikh Ndoye, with Romain Thomas, who's didn't have a great season this season, but has been linked with Premier League clubs in the past. The fact of the matter is it's not always pretty, but this manager Moulin has always exceeded expectations with the resources he has. Now, I'm not sure about his relationship to the club's transfer team and whether or not Crivelli, Torre, Guillaume were the sorts of players that he wanted. But when those players weren't working out, when they had issues with injury, in the case of Torre, when they left themselves on loan, in the case of Crivelli, it didn't matter. Moulin buckled down and allowed this team to continue to punch above its weight. I mean, let's be honest. There's some decent players here. Santa Maria and Thomas Mangiani are decent players, but really, there's not a lot in this. There's not a lot of players on this team who would necessarily walk into other teams in Ligue 1. And for him to continue to do that season after season, year after year, with the constant churn of players, constant being forced to lose his best players. Toko Ekambi is on his way out, likely to Villarreal, as a team that's been linked with him on numerous occasions. It really does say a lot about his abilities. And frankly, I'd like to see him be given a chance with a club of perhaps a little bit more means. I think that'd be very interesting come summer. But again, that extension shows that Angers, despite a bit of a struggle this season, really believe in his philosophy, really believe in his methods, and really believe in him keeping his team in the top division.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like the big rumours, Adam, that Carl Toko Ekambi will be heading on to pastures new, but it won't be the Premier League. It looks like it will be Villarreal, at least anyway. A good move for him?
Yeah, I think so. I think he kind of suits the way that he would play. I mean, I know he's played up front on his own on a number of, pretty much exclusively for Angers, but he's very capable of playing wide, and that's the way he started his career. And you look at the way Villarreal play, classically, 4-4-2, with support and using his pace. I think that could really suit him really quite nicely, and he sort of fills that Cedric Bakambu kind of mold. He's a very kind of similar sort of player to that slotted in nicely to that Villarreal team. So yeah, I think that's a really good move for him, and the right kind of step up as well.
Yeah, it's sort of that sort of. There was a lot of rumours, wasn't there, in January that it would be sort of Brighton, and whether that would be the right sort of club for him to make the next step. It was a question, but with Villarreal having Europa League football in a competitive league, a good team with interesting players around him like Sami Castillejo and a few others, Carlos Bacca to learn off of, it's going to be an interesting move if that does come off for him. It'd be a big one for them. Onto a team that are probably, arguably, Adam, this season's Montpellier maybe is the main nice way to put it, is that Caen have sort of flattered to deceive sometimes. I mentioned that every time I seem to watch them, they ended up winning, so maybe it was better for other people to see them and really comment on how they played. But they were the team that this season, especially with the run that they went on to finish the campaign, they were pretty abysmal for a long period, but it was a fact the dearth of quality behind them, really, and a point against Paris Saint-Germain yet again in a side that's really didn't really turn up in that final game, that's helped them just about keep their heads above water.
Yeah, I think they've got relatively lucky, over the last couple of years. I think 2 seasons in a row they've needed a point pretty much against PSG and got it both times through sort of to stay up, sort of, or at least to aid their bid for survival on the last day of the season, and they've got it both times. So, there's an element of fortune there, because if PSG are going for the title, or if PSG are, challenging for something on the last, probably would be the title on the last day of the season, then, I don't see Caen getting any points from either of those games. So they've been a bit fortunate. And I think, they're a club that were promoted relatively recently, and they're the type of club that, given the way that their season and their squad is kind of panning out, Patrice Goron's left. He's done a decent job there. And you look at their sort of their key players, and you look at like the forward line. Ivan Santini's had a poor season, dropped off goals wide. Enzo Crivelli failed to score enough goals, and even though he was sort of in and out of the team with Santini the last few weeks of the season, there's issues there. Julien Ferre is 35 now. He's not going to be able to sort of plod along for much longer. And then even defensively, Jiku's a good player, Gilbert's a good player as well, and they've both been productive this season. But Damien De Silva's getting into his 30s now. There are holes in the team, and it's going to be very difficult to see that. If they find that another final day point against Paris Saint-Germain is pretty unlikely next season if they keep going the way they're going. I generally think that they're the type of team that are going to be looking to very seriously at relegation next season. I think the key factor, obviously, now Goron's left, is who is their new manager, and a lot of names have been mentioned, and Pellissier has been mentioned from Amiens, which makes sense for Caen's point of view, but I'm not sure it makes sense from Pelissier's point of view, given that the players he's brought in at Amiens, and despite the smaller budget, relatively, not too much smaller really, he's almost like there isn't really a step up. I know that they're a more established league inside, but I don't know that there's much point in making that move for him. Hubert Fournier was mentioned, which would have been a really good appointment for a club like Caen, but he's turned that down. And Philippe Montagnier was mentioned as well, but he's gone to Lens. So they're sort of running out of options, and I don't see Jocelyn Gourvenet going there either necessarily. That mentioned was in the Nantes situation. So they're kind of already a little bit down on options. Frank Passy's been mentioned, but I don't know that he's ever really had any productive spell in charge of Marseille, mainly, and Lille. They were very, they scraped survival again, and I just think that they're a little bit lacking in focal point, and the manager for a club like Caen, as we talked about with Moulin for Angers, that would be crucial for them. And Goron has been that kind of focal point in the last, particularly this season. And without him, it's very difficult to see where they develop. So a tough summer for them, given that their squad is lacking strength in certain areas. No manager in just yet. Next season could be a tough one for them.
Yeah, and that's where the interesting point for me, Eric, comes up on this one with Caen, is that with Patrice Goron leaving, like other teams, you think that he's just about kept them safe. He's obviously just ready to move on from this club, but it really lies on them now to find the right man to take them forward, because really this cut-off point with players like Damien De Silva's even linked with a move away. They've got strikers not grabbing goals. Ronnie Rodeland's not had the greatest season. The team is aging. Other players are going back, like Benet says, going back to Monaco and possibly going out on another loan. But at the same time, this is a really important move for Caen this season, because this summer could really define whether they maybe will go in, go into next season as one of the favourites to go down?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the points we've made there are good. I mean, and let's face it, Caen do have a good history bringing through young players. We look at Jan Caramo, Jean-Victor Makengo, left last summer, Thomas Lamar, of course. There's a history of younger talent coming through there. And I think we've seen that again with Jean Repage, Jesse Dimengue this season. There's something there that I think would attract the right manager, someone with a history of working with young players and getting them to come on. So, I don't want to tie a name to this at present, but I think that this should be a more attractive situation than it would otherwise. I do think though, and I think that part of the frustration here and part of what might be limiting the Norman side's options are a lack of money. Caen didn't really spend last year. I mean, I know they did bring in Jiku, and they made Gilbert's what had been a loan permanent, but I think that paucity of options financially really would make any manager of any certain level of quality, despite their reputation for working with young players, take a moment, take it, and give them pause to decide whether they want to hitch their wagon to a team that might end up going down. They would rather avoid having that relegation on their CV.
Yeah, it's a real middle ground for Caen at the moment. They need to decide whether maybe they should try and do a little bit more to try and push on, or whether they can risk keep consolidating like this and getting good moments that just about keep them up, given the depth of quality below them. But with the sides coming up, some of them look pretty good as well, with Toulouse staying in and maybe being able to get some money from some of the sales. You think that teams like not necessarily, but Lille might not be down there next season if they can get the right kind of players, and you think Strasbourg might push on, Angers close to them might push on. It does start making you worry that little bit more, really. On to a side that did go down, unfortunately, and we won't be seeing next season is Troyes. It wasn't, as we mentioned the other week on our main show, Eric, we mentioned that it's not quite the embarrassment it was a couple of seasons ago, where they really never really looked like a Ligue 1 side. They had for moments in this season, but in the end of the day, when they got back to those last 5 or 6 games, they just left themselves with too much to do against teams that were difficult to play against, even though they gave good games to Marseille and to Saint-Etienne, where they were ahead in both those games for a time. When you're having to face Lyon and Montpellier and Monaco to end the season, it always felt like they'd maybe given themselves too much to do, and in the essence, they didn't really have the power and the goal, especially up front, to keep themselves in Liga.
Yeah, it was frustrating. I think that this team, I think just the story of their season was inconsistency, and I think we could look at Samuel Granser as being sort of a good example of that. I mean, Granser, is a very bright player. He's been included with the latest set of under 21s as Espoir. But in terms of his consistency from week to week, sometimes he was brilliant, and sometimes he was losing the ball every time he touched it. I think that's really what it is. And I feel for this team, but at the same time, I don't. I think that if players can show a certain level of ability and drive, and then there's something to be said for that. But if they can't show it consistently, well, that has to be on the manager. And I think that has to be on the players themselves. I think really, having seen Troyes 12 times, 15 times this season, a good amount. I think really the only players that can come out of this with any credit to themselves would probably be Darbion and Karim Azamoun, both of whom, Azamoun in particular, I think will stay in Ligue 1. Darbion probably not, given his age, but there really isn't a whole lot to separate this. There really isn't a whole lot to separate this team from the middling sides in Ligue 2 and sides that were pushing for promotion in Ligue 2. And I think that that's really their level, barring significant investment. Just an overall lack of consistency. You have a player like Souk or Nyan, score 3 and 5 and then not score for a dozen matches. And the more you continue to see that throughout the team, this unevenness in terms of performance, and the fact that you're relying on 41-year-old Benjamin Nive to be one of your fulcrums in attack. It's just a team that's constructed in a way that's problematic. So I think that's all that it really stems down to. It's players who can't maintain a level of ability and drive and motivation that's sufficient to stay in Ligue 1.
Yeah, and that's the interesting point for them now, really, Adam. And for the last couple of seasons, really, they felt a bit like a yo-yo club, similar to maybe a Mets and others. While they sort of maybe, some would argue, stuck into Ligue 1 with a playoff and beating a Lorient side that was sort of down on the luck. It's getting tougher and tougher to get out of the Ligue 2 with that playoff now as well, and two sides exiting Ligue 2 that look pretty good, but there's plenty still quality-wise still in there. You look at teams like Lens are still going to be there next season and will always be a side that even though they didn't do great this season, that teams will look at. There's teams like Le Havre and Brest who play very well. There's still big teams like Lorient and some would argue Sochaux and Auxerre to a certain degrees as well. Can they still maintain this one, or really do I feel like maybe even though it sounds not like the ideal scenario, but maybe a couple of years in Ligue 2, maybe to build themselves back up, really will be the positive here rather than bounce straight back?
Yeah, quite possibly. I think Eric makes a really good point in that there's no they don't really seem to have much difference between them and the sort of upper mid-table Ligue 2 side. But I think there is something in that perhaps is a little bit of a positive in that their side won't change too much over the course of the summer. Christophe Harel will definitely leave. I would imagine he would be interesting a lot of Ligue 1 sides as a centre back. He's had a really good year. But apart from that, Azamoum is an interesting one as well, as Eric mentioned, Grandsir perhaps. But the bulk of the team will probably sit together, which is pretty unusual for a side relegated to Ligue 2. There's often a lot of turnover, by the start of September. So I think that will play into their hands and will be something of a positive, given that they were competitive this season. If, as Eric said, inconsistent and one good enough to stay up, they'll be able to sort of build on the nucleus of this team, which is solid, by Ligue 2 standards, and probably better than solid by Ligue 2 standards. So they'll have opportunities to chase promotion again next season if Jean-Louis Garcia stays and if they can make the right additions. Then I think that they might spend a couple of years in Ligue 2, but I can see them coming back to Ligue 1 pretty soon. And who knows? They might be third time lucky. It might sort of be the time for them to really make good on that nucleus of the team and finally sort of stay up. And I think they're a club that is capable of that, but it's just making the right additions and building a team capable of staying in Ligue 1, and that wasn't the case this year, unfortunately.
And it'd be interesting to see if they can maybe do prove me wrong and bounce back next season. On to our final team this evening, and we do leave one of the most interesting teams till last, and that is Marseille. They've had a really, in hindsight at least, Adam, a tremendous season. I mean, many didn't expect that Marseille would be fighting till the bitter end for Champions League football. We all thought they might challenge for Europe, but not quite at that level. But with the Europa League final defeat in the way that it happened as well, and then a couple of days later getting a good win, but in the end it mattering no for Lyon obviously going on to win. So they miss out on two possibilities of automatic Champions League football. In the end, we'll go into Europa League next season, and that sort of adds a little bit of a sour taste to what had been, really, if you were to give Marseille fans this at the start of the season, what they would have said it would have been a very good season.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point as to how Marseille's season will be perceived in the long run, or perhaps even in the short term as well. I think that, you made some interesting points there about the fact that they probably weren't necessarily they weren't expected to make top three, but I think they were expected to challenge. And given the way that their project is going, the signings they've made, the money spent on Luis Gustavo's wages, Florent Thauvin and Dimitri Payet kicking on, or at least they hope they would. Adel Rami coming in, Steve Mandanda coming back. There are a lot of positives in terms of personnel, and I think given that Monaco's, they sold so many players over the last summer, Lyon's team, was picked apart with Lacazette and Tolisso and Gonlon leaving as well. They would have been expected to be in and amongst those sides. So I think challenging for Champions League but not quite making it was probably about par for them this season. The Europa League is obviously a separate issue, and it does colour their season differently because, Marseille are a club, in my opinion, still the biggest in France. And they're a club that expects to challenge at that, the sharp end of European competitions. And they did that this season. So there's huge credit there to go to Garcia and the way they played against Leipzig. Obviously, were very good in the Bundesliga last year, and are a good side. And they Braga and Athletic Bilbao, they were really good against those teams and really looked like a genuine force in the Europa League at least. Obviously, it's not the Champions League, which where they see themselves. But given the way it kind of panned out, it does feel like it is tinged, as you said, tinged disappointment given that they didn't make the Champions League somehow, which I think, although not 100% their stated aim as in they had to make the Champions League this season, was something they're extremely hopeful about for much of the campaign. And the hierarchy of the club would have been coming into sort of March time, when Lyon had dropped off and Monaco were a little bit sort of struggling. There was they could have even finished second at one point. So given that they finished fourth and they didn't win Europa League, obviously Atletico Madrid a far superior team to them at the moment, then I think they're actually, over the course of the year, that you kind of look back and it's almost sort of about evens, sort of about par for them this season. So it'd be interesting to see how next season plays out. Additions of Yaya Touré's been mentioned, Balotelli's been mentioned heavily, that they'll go and strengthen again, I would imagine, although their money might not be as there as some Marseille fans would hope. But although it's been good, it hasn't been as good as they would have hoped or as good as it could have been. So I honestly think it's only really about par for Marseille. They're a bigger club than this season suggests, and they'll expect to do much better next year.
Yeah, and it's about getting that sort of right mix of hopes and dreams right, isn't it? But I mean, you think back earlier, Eric, that it feels frustrating that they've missed out, and at the same time, the worry for the quote unquote champions project is they've certainly got the right manager in place in Rudy Garcia, and I think he's proved that this season, and plenty of good players. But at the same time, the difference between Champions League football and Europa League football for attracting the talents they want to improve the squad to push on next season can be a little bit dramatic, even if they are looking at players like Balotelli and the likes. If other teams with Champions League football are looking at them as well, they're going to be the ones slightly behind in the queue, and they may be stuck at, while they expect to probably be in the Europa League at least anyway, they may be a slight step back from where they want to be in terms of how they want to be progressing at the moment.
I don't know. I would kind of take a little bit of issue with that. I think that realistically, this team could stand to have a little bit more depth. Obviously, the injury to Sakai down the back end of the season was a big issue in terms of his ability to play both flanks. So getting a second choice left back, which is not Henry Berimo, sorry, keeping hold of the players that have been linked away. I think Bouna Sarr is the only one I've really seen any tangible rumors linking away, and getting and upgrading at striker and probably getting another center back in. I know Boubacar Kamara is impressed, especially given his age. I think he's 18, 19. But getting another center back with more experience, maybe that's Sertic, now that he's fit. But I think that what's in place for this team in terms of being methodical and getting the results they need in Ligue 1 with a slightly deeper squad, because really that was their undoing. Marseille are in good shape. I think that they struggled against the biggest sides, and this is an issue that I've had my battles on Twitter with people about. And I think Marseille only took 2 points from their matches against their other rivals in the top four. And that should be improved upon, but I don't think it's necessarily the issue. I think the issue is a lack of depth in this squad. It's getting 80 points again doesn't seem like an obstacle, particularly if a top class striker is brought in. Payet seems motivated. Thauvin seems motivated. Now, if you've got those players, if you've got a striker who can contribute 10, 12, 15 goals and do that and play well on a consistent basis, I think this team has the pieces that they need. Rudy Garcia has not only allowed this team to become more solid, but also improve players. I mean, I didn't think we'd be looking at the likes of Lucas Ocampos, for example, looking at the likes of Amavi as being players who could operate in this sphere. I know Amavi was very highly thought of before he left for Aston Villa back in, what was that, 2014, 2015? But to see him doing this consistently on at this level is hugely impressive. And I think that I think they, with the right investment, and it doesn't have to be heavy investment this summer, Marseille should realistically be positioning themselves to be right back in there in terms of that battle. I think with the losses that we're expecting, and then we already have seen with Monaco, losing Fabinho today to Liverpool, that there's a wealth of opportunity there, particularly if Monaco suffer losses in the forms of be it Camille Glick, be it Thomas Lemar, maybe Falcao wants to go to China. Lyon's situation is very up in the air as well. Marcelo was linked with AC Milan today. Nabil Fekir is likely off. So Marseille had that massive advantage of having this continuity, having this solidity, having a manager in Rudy Garcia who's been there. And I think, despite a disappointing end to the season, this team, maybe depending on but knowing that they're not going to undergo the turmoil that Monaco and Lyon are likely to, even if players stay, they'll be unsettled. Marseille should, I think, be rightly tipped as favorites for second for next season.
It'd be an interesting one there. I'm sure many Marseille fans will be wagging their tongues at you for saying that, at least, Eric. That's all for tonight and for this season. My thanks to Rich, Peter, Jeremy, Eric, Adam, and everyone who's contributed to the show this year. And, of course, all of you listening at home. Do keep your eyes peeled for any specials that we may decide to do over the summer and for our return before of the start of the next campaign. But until then, it's à bientôt and goodbye.